So now that we've touched on what an archives is, so an archives is the place where we store historic records, what some of those records are, and when we do and do not create them for the people, places, and events in Warren County, and then what an archivist does. Now I would like to talk about doing research at an archives. So first of all, I want to point out why it is so important for students to understand what an archives is and why researching at an archives is important. So first of all, a lot of people aren't familiar with what an archives is. So I want to make sure that as students, you understand the importance of knowing what an archives is and being familiar with what you can do at an archives. So you're starting your career as a student and you're going to be researching a lot of topics. So an archives is a great place that you can go to find information about pretty much any topic that you want. So at the Warren County Record Center and Archives specifically, we only have stuff about Warren County, Ohio. But let's say, for instance, you wanted to do a research topic, let's say about the Wright brothers. So if you wanted to find some information about the Wright brothers, you can go to Wright State University and their archives will have information about the Wright brothers. Now, why is it important to know about researching at an archives versus, let's say, for instance, researching at a library? So at an archives, everything that we keep at the archives are what are called primary sources. And most archives are full of primary sources. Now, what do I mean by a primary source? So primary sources are a source created by someone who has experienced an event. So what I mean by a primary source, so some good examples of primary sources, so newspaper reports by someone who was at an event that experienced it. Newspaper articles are great primary sources. Original research done by someone, those are great primary sources. Photographs, videos, diaries, letters, all of these are great examples of primary sources. Another great example of a primary source are the types of records that we have here at the archives. So these records were all created at the time of the events that are being recorded. So everything that we have here at Warren County Record Center and Archives are what we would call primary sources. So for instance, the birth records that we have, since those were recorded at the time of those people's births, those are considered primary sources. Now, secondary sources, those are generally something created after the event by someone who did not experience it. So some great examples of secondary sources would be books, newspaper articles written by people who were not there. Documentaries are a great secondary source. Let's see. Scholarly and other articles about topics, those are all great examples of secondary sources. So everything that we have here at the archives, like I said, are primary sources. We do not have any secondary sources that we keep. So one of the great examples that I like to use for students that's familiar, so if you've ever heard of the Declaration of Independence, so that was written in the late 1700s, and that is on a document, so that's a historic record that helps tell the history of the entire United States. So that document is stored at the National Archives. The people who take care of it are archivists just like me. So we would consider the Declaration of Independence, because it was created at the time of that event, as a primary source. Now let's say, for instance, in your textbook, the author of your textbook is writing about the Declaration of Independence and what happened surrounding that event. So your textbook, because it is utilizing the research of the primary source, but that person wasn't there at the time of that event, so that is considered a secondary source. So the Declaration of Independence, that is the primary source that that person used for their research. And then the secondary source would be the book, your textbook that they created that helps teach you about it. Now, that goes into why is it important for students to know about an archives? So when you are doing research in the future, your teachers or your professors will be asking you to research topics using primary sources. And I want to make sure that you know what an archives is and how valuable they can be to you, because they are a great place to find primary sources. Because primary sources can be a lot harder to find than secondary sources. So if you ever have a topic that you want to find out more information, if you just type in a search on the internet for an archives and whatever your topic is, most likely there's an archives out there that can help you find primary source research. And this will be super important to you in the future.